Hey everyone, every year I do a top 10 predictions video where I try to guess what my top 10 books for the year are going to be. So that's what this video is, but before I get to that, I'm first going to look back at my 2023 predictions and see how well I did. So if you want to skip the recap and jump straight to what my predictions are for 2024, I'll make sure I have chapter titles so that it's easy to do that. But without wasting any more time, let's get started with how did I do on my top 10 predictions for 2023. Starting with my number 10 prediction, Sunlit Man by Brandon Sanderson. Well, if you've watched my top 10 video of 2023, you'll know Sunlit Man finished number 10. So I was spot on with this prediction. It was my favorite of the secret projects, and it was probably my favorite Sanderson book that I've read since Rhythm of War. It did a great job of really getting me excited for Stormlight 5 to come out later this year. At number 9 was The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. This is the first book in the Lycanius trilogy. My favorite of the trilogy ended up being book 3. I think that's A Light of All That Falls. And that finished 8th on my list. So I was close, slightly off, had the wrong book in the series, and off by one spot. These next few I ended up being pretty far off the mark with. With number 8, I predicted The Return of the Griffin. This is the second book in the Hybrid Helix series by J.C.M. Byrne. Unfortunately, my brain, it did not like taking the world that was built out in Wistful Ascending and moving that back to Earth. Those two worlds did not mesh well to me, and because of that, I just couldn't enjoy the book. The world just did not work for me at all. My number 7 prediction was Dead Stars Part 2 by Ben Galley. This was the 4th and final book in the Emaneska series, and in this one, it's not so much a reflection of that I didn't like the 4th book, but I really didn't like the 3rd book. In the 3rd book, the main character becomes completely unbearable. And I kind of lost interest in the story, and there was no hope for the 4th book because I no longer cared about any of these characters or the world or what was going to happen because the 3rd book ruined my enjoyment of it. My prediction for number 6 was Lords of the North. I believe this is the 3rd book in the Saxon series or the Saxon Tales by Bernard Cornwell. And I never read it. So maybe I'll like it. But what happened was I was listening to these through my library, through Libby, and the narrator changed between book 2 and book 3. And I really like the narrator that did books 1 and 2. So switching it with book 3 just threw me off, and I ended up not continuing the series. I'm going to continue. I just needed more time to let the narration I was used to kind of get out of my head so that I wasn't expecting one voice and hearing another voice. So sometime in 2024, I'm going to continue this series. But as far as my prediction for 2023, didn't even read the book, so it doesn't make it on the list. At number 5, my prediction was Crownbreaker by Sebastian de Castell. He was one of my favorite authors from 2022 or 2021. I absolutely loved the Greatcoats. So I figured, why not predict the final book in his next series to be a favorite of mine. And that book, Crownbreaker, was my favorite of the series, but overall the series was good, not great. If I had done honorable mentions in my top 10 video for the year, Crownbreaker would have been one of the honorable mentions, but it wasn't quite at the level to be included in the top 10 overall. At number 4 was Fool's Fate by Robin Hobb. This is the 3rd and final book in the Tawny Man trilogy. I figured this would be my favorite of the trilogy, and I was not wrong. What I was wrong about was just how much I would like it. This is going to be one of my favorite books of all time. I ended up putting it number 2 on my list. So I was right that it was going to be one of my favorites, just underestimated how much I would like it. At number 3 was Esarhaddon by Michael J. Sullivan. This kind of concludes his World of Elan books, kind of. It was the final missing piece between the Rhaenyra world and Legends of the First Empire. So I went in with a lot of expectations because Sullivan is usually fantastic at concluding series. And while this does conclude the Bridge series, at the same time, it was a middle piece of the overall series. So it didn't work as well for me because you already kind of know what's going to happen. So I didn't have as much tension as if I had read the books chronologically instead of from publication order. So if I was to redo the series, I think me personally, I would have started with Legends of the First Empire, Rise and Fall, and then jump into Rhaenyra Revelations and Rhaenyra Chronicles. My prediction for number 2 was Superpowered's Year 3. Now, the only reason I predicted Year 3 instead of Year 4 was because Year 4 is an almost 2,000 page book, a 60-hour audiobook, and I wasn't sure if I was going to be getting to it. But if you've been following the channel, you know I went on a huge Drew Hayes binge at the beginning of 2023, went right through everything that he had out, all like 19 or 20 books, including Superpowered Year 4, which was my favorite of the series, and I ended up putting it as number 4 overall in my top 10. But again, that video, I said number 4, number 3, number 2, and number 1. Any of them I could have picked as the number 1 spot. They were all that good. So it's kind of a 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, and then number 5. There was a big drop between the top 4 and number 5. And Superpowered Year 4 was in that top 4. So I was right that I was going to love this series and love how the book ended. I was just wrong on, again, how much I was going to like the series and want to binge it. My number 1 prediction was Of War and Ruin by Ryan Cahill. This is another one that I was right that I was going to love it. I said in my prediction video that it could possibly become one of my favorite books of all time. And I was right. It is one of my favorite books of all time. I ended up placing this at number 3 overall for the year. So it was virtually tied with Superpowered Year 4 and Fool's Fate. And in a lot of ways tied with what ended up being my favorite book of the year, The Will of the Many by James Islington. That didn't make my prediction video because I didn't even know about it before it was published. So I think for my predictions, I started off pretty good with my number 10 and number 9 predictions, ended really good with my top 4 predictions, kind of was off in the middle. Now with all that out of the way, let's take a look at what my predictions are for 2024. Now instead of doing a top 10, I'm going to do a top 13. The reason I'm doing top 13 is a lot of these are new releases that don't actually have a publication date set yet. So there's a chance a few of these don't get published this year. So I'll do 13, and if one doesn't get published when I do my review next year, I'll just take that one off the list and move the rest up. And hopefully with these 13, I end up getting through 10 books that are, in fact, published by the end of 2024. So let's get started with my number 13 prediction. It's going to be Drumidor by Michael J. Sullivan. This is Rhaenyra Revelations Book 5. So going back to Royce and Hadrian. And of everything that Sullivan has written, the Rhaenyra part of it has always been my favorite. The banter between Royce and Hadrian are top notch, and I've just always had a good time with any of their stories. And at this point, it's been a bit since we've gotten a new Royce and Hadrian story, so I'm really looking forward to it. At number 12, I'm going with The Art of Prophecy by Wesley Chu. Now, I know virtually nothing about this book. It was one that was recommended to me by Trin over at Portable Magic. After she gave me the recommendation, I looked the book up, read some reviews, saw what it was about, and it really caught my attention. However, that was a few weeks ago, and at this point, I don't remember what the book was about, but I do remember I was really excited to read it at some point this year. And I tend to trust Trin whenever she gives me a recommendation, so it's going to go number 12 on my list. At number 11, I'm going with An Instruction in Shadow by Benedict Jacka. This is going to be book 2 of the Inheritance of Magic series. This is his new series. Alex Verus was his first series, and I absolutely loved it. As far as Inheritance of Magic, I enjoyed the first book, but overall, it felt like it was a setup book for the rest of the series. So now that we're continuing the series, I'm really intrigued with where it's going to go and expecting big things. And I don't think book 2 is going to be my favorite of the series when all is said and done, but I do think it's going to be a big step up from book 1 as far as my experience goes. So I'm going to put it at number 11 with hopes that future books in the series are eventually in the conversation for favorite books of all time or favorite books of the year. At number 10 is going to be The Shadow Gate by L.L. McRae. This is the second book in her Dragon Spirits series. Now, I read The Iron Crown, I think towards the end of 2022, and it almost made my top 10 list. I meant to read The Shadow Gate in 2023, but for some reason, I just never got to it. I think it's because I was mainly focused on what books I physically have on my shelves, and that's one I only have the audiobook for. But this year, I'm making it a focus on listening to the audiobooks that I don't own physical copies of as well. So I am guaranteeing that I will be listening to The Shadowgate at some point. And if it comes close to being as good as what The Iron Crown was, I have no doubts this will be in the conversation, my top 10, by the end of the year. At number 9, I'm going to go with The Last Horizon number 3 by Will White. I think this is going to be titled The Night. I heard that from, I think it was just a fan of the series. So I haven't actually heard Will say it, but I don't follow Will White all that closely. Now, this is one of those books that I don't necessarily know for sure that's going to be published. I actually have no idea what the plans are for this series. However, it's supposed to be 6 legendary heroes on a legendary ship completing 6 legendary tasks or 6 legendary goals or dreams or whatever you want to describe it as. And their story ends when either they die or they complete all of these legendary objectives, and then they all go their separate way. So book 1 was the captain, book 2 was the engineer. So it makes sense if book 3 is going to be the knight and accomplishing his goal, especially with how his goal was introduced. It had a cap of has to be within 5 years. So it's reasonable that what he wants to do is going to happen sometime soon. And this story, it was just such a fun and exciting, fast-paced story that I could just let my mind take a break and just let my imagination wander and take off. I didn't have to remember how the magic system worked or anything like that. It was just a good time. So I'm predicting that to come in at number 9 overall. So hopefully he sticks to what seems to be his schedule of 1 book every 6 months, and we get book 3 in the series in about 5 months from now. At number 8, I'm predicting Dawn of Wonder by Jonathan Renshaw. This is one where there's a pretty big group of us on the Wizards Enclave Discord that we're planning to buddy read it in April. It's one I haven't heard much about, but it was recommended to me. I looked it up on Goodreads. It does have a lot of reviews, and it certainly looks like one that's going to be right up my alley as far as epic fantasies go. At number 7 is Play of Shadows by Sebastian de Castell. This is the first book in his newest series. It's going to be following a different Greatcoat than the Greatcoats that you met in the Greatcoat series. And he did already release the prequel to it, and I enjoyed the prequel. So based on what I saw in that, I think I'm going to really enjoy this follow-up series as well. The prequel was a honorable mention for my top 10. So I think the series is just going to keep getting better. At number 6, this is projecting out that it will be published this year, but I don't know that for sure. It's Villain's Code number 3 by Drew Hayes. I've already mentioned Drew Hayes earlier in the video that I've loved pretty much everything he's written. Out of, I think, close to 25 books now, I've never given anything lower than a 4-star rating. And I think I've given like 15, 16 5-star ratings. So Villain's Code number 3, that's assuring to be one of my favorite books of the year. The fact that I'm listing this at number 6 just tells you how high my expectations are for the top 5 on this list. Starting with number 5, it's going to be 12 Months by Jim Butcher. Another one that I'm projecting will be released in 2024, but right now he's not done with it. So it might not make it this year. And again, that's why I have 13 predictions and not just 10. But if 12 Months comes out, I think that's going to be my 5th favorite book of the year. The Dresden Files is one of my favorite series of all time, and after Battlegrounds, there's going to be a lot that 12 Months has to cover. There's a lot of implications from how that ended. Each book just keeps getting bigger and more epic and more intense, and I just can't wait to see where the series goes from here. At number 4 is A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin. This is the third book in A Song of Ice and Fire. I am very late to the game for starting this series. I read Game of Thrones a few months ago. It was actually one that I had picked up several times and repeatedly DNF'd it before I was a big fantasy reader. Now that I'm more used to fantasy, I gave it another shot. And I can see why I DNF'd it at the beginning. But this time I was able to get through. Really enjoyed it. It would have been another honorable mention for my top 10. From what I've heard of the series, book 3 tends to be the favorite amongst his fans. So I'm going to list that as my predicted favorite of the series because I plan on catching up on the series this year. And coming in number 4 overall. At number 3 may be a bit of a surprise to some people, but I'm going with Wind and Truth by Brandon Sanderson. That's right, it's not what I'm predicting to be my favorite book of the year. Predicting it at number 3, Stormlight Archive. Yes, it's my favorite series. Yes, this is the conclusion of the first era. However, I didn't like Rhythm of War as much as I liked the first 3 in the series, and I didn't like the last Mistborn Era 2 book as much as I liked the book 3 of that era. So it's kind of been trending down just a little bit. I felt all of the Cosmere connections are getting to be too much for me, where there's just too much to remember and it's too convoluted and it's not as simple and straightforward as the earlier books are, as far as you just have to know what's going on in this world. Now you have to know what's going on in the whole Cosmere, and that can be a lot and it can be overwhelming, and for me it is a bit too much, and that's why it's coming in at number 3 on this video. That also tells you how high my expectations are for these top 2. Number 2 is Of Empires and Dust. This is the 4th book in The Bound and the Broken by Ryan Cahill. Book 2 finished as one of my favorite 3 or 4 books of 2022. Book 3 finished as number 3 on my list in 2023. I expect book 4 to keep the trend going and to be a top 3 read for me this year in 2024. Specifically, I'm placing it at number 2 overall. Because of the length, this is another one that might not get delivered in 2024, but based on his track record, I'm going to assume it will be delivered until he says it won't be, and I'm going to assume it will maintain, if not raise the standards from earlier in the series. And my predicted number 1 book of the year will be The Strength of the Few by James Islington. This is going to be the sequel to The Will of the Many, which was my top book in 2023. I figure if a series can start that well, and book 2 tends to be one of my favorite books in almost every series I've read, so I'm going to have huge expectations for The Strength of the Few. Hopefully that doesn't set me up to be disappointed, but based on what I've seen, I think it's going to be able to live up to the expectations and the hype. And I'm just so excited to get through all of the books on this list. I think it's going to be a great year in 2024. Let me know in the comments, what was some of your favorites from 2023, and did you expect them to be a favorite of yours when you read them? And what do you think will be one of your favorites in 2024? And until next time, bye.